A town in fear. Behind the campaign of terror, a plot to extort millions from Britain's biggest retailer.
People will be injured and potentially killed.
A single threatening letter would start a huge manhunt.
We're advising members of the public to be extremely vigilant.
Explosive devices targeting the innocent, the evil trademark of the Tesco bomber.
A letter exploded in her face.
For the police, a race against time, a trail of cryptic codes and ciphers, surveillance and secret stakeouts.
You're going to be seen. It's whether you're noticed.
The challenge to stop the mystery bomber before he could strike again. At stake, £50 million and the lives of innocent people. Bournemouth, on England's south coast, magnet for tourists and one of the wealthiest towns in the country. But in 2000, a threatening cloud appeared over this summer playground, putting its residents and visitors in deadly peril. It began with a bizarre phone call to the Director of Security for Tesco, Britain's biggest supermarket chain.
We received a phone call from a newsagent in Bournemouth. Someone had used a photocopier and had left the original and thought we might be interested in it. We were most certainly interested in it because it was basically a demand on Tesco stores.
The letter left on the newsagent's photocopier contained a chilling threat. It demanded money from Tesco and warned of deadly consequences if the company failed to comply.
The letter made demands with the threats that if Tesco's didn't provide that money, then Tesco's customers would be hurt by bombs being sent through the post to them.
The letter contained few clues about the author's identity.
It was signed Sally and was headed without prejudice, but unusually that was spelt incorrectly.
The extortionists signed themselves off with a woman's name. But was this a woman? I think quite a few of us had our reservations that it was a woman, but again, we kept an open mind.
But despite the mystery of who Sally really was, the letter made clear how Tesco were to deliver the money.
He required that Tesco's produce club cards that would be placed in all of the Daily Echo's newspapers on a particular day, and that each of those club cards would have been set up and capable of being used in ATM machines.
The Daily Echo was Dorset's biggest local newspaper, with a circulation of more than 50,000 copies. If each paper contained a modified Tesco club card that could be used to withdraw cash, the extortioner was in line for a mammoth payout.
Sally had provided a PIN number that only he would know. What he required was to be able to withdraw £1,000 per club card. If all the club cards were set up to withdraw £1,000, effectively Tesco's could lose £50 million in a day.
Tesco realised that even if Sally was unable to collect all the cards himself, they still faced the prospect of enormous losses.
Let's say that we complied with the demand, given him or her a code, and then this individual goes on local radio and says, by the way, if you use one of those cards that was in the Bournemouth Echo today, and this is the PIN number, you'll get £1,000. We could have had people going to every ATM in the Bournemouth area using these cards. I mean, it's a huge risk.
One of the first puzzles for the police was why the extortioner had singled out Tesco. By the summer of 2000, the company was attracting widespread publicity for its booming profits and aggressive expansion. But as officers working on the case soon discovered, it was making enemies as well as headlines.
Tesco's is a massive multinational company. They'd had a number of complaints made against them. There were a number of civil litigation type cases against them. And clearly there were a wide range of people that might have a grievance against Tesco's and cause them to try and commit this type of offence.
There have been a number of past employees that had been dismissed for misconduct or had left the company with a little bit of a grudge. But they certainly had to be considered as possible suspects.
Perhaps more worrying was the theory that Sally was not working alone, but was part of an organised gang.
You would imagine that Sally was an individual man that wanted to make money for himself. But you had to bear in mind that effectively this could be a large criminal organisation, it could be some type of anarchist group, and they could be working in unison.
There was always a possibility of that. I mean, is this an activist group that are trying to get back at us or use us to promote their cause?
On August the 30th, detectives got their first potential breakthrough. Tesco received a second threatening letter, identical to the first, except that it was fire damaged. Had the author had second thoughts after sending it?
Sally may have been concerned that that original letter had been left on the photocopier. Perhaps he felt that he'd been seen.
One of the considerations was that he or she had tried to destroy the letter that they'd posted.
But in attempting to burn the evidence, the extortioner had given the police a possible lead.
It was really important to me that I located where that fire had occurred, and I presumed it was likely to be in a postbox somewhere in Bournemouth. So we made inquiries and found out that in fact there had been a fire in a postbox at a place called Bradpole Road in Bournemouth.
As police went to examine the burned-out postbox, their spirits were high. They now not only had a possible source of forensic clues, it also seemed that Sally had given up his extortion campaign as quickly as he'd started it. But their mood soon changed. Tesco received a third letter, one which upped the stakes. It said small bombs were ready to be sent to its customers' homes. And if demands weren't met, the bombs would get bigger.
When Tesco's received the letter at their Ferndown store, quite clearly this was a serious extortion demand. We were very keen to know what we were dealing with here. Did we have an individual who was determined to cause serious harm to Tesco's customers? What was this individual's motivation? Extremely concerning times for us and some questions that we needed to get some answers to.
But as Tesco examined the latest letter in detail, they discovered a serious flaw in Sally's plans.
£1,000 was what he wanted for any single transaction. It's not possible to get £1,000 worth of notes through the ATM aperture. It won't work.
The police didn't want Sally to feel they were ignoring his threats. They felt they had no choice but to contact him and explain the problem with his ATM plan. They would communicate via the Bournemouth Echo, just as the letters demanded.
We used an undercover police officer to place an advert in the local paper asking Sally to contact us by way of a phone number, hoping that we could trick him into responding.
The first secret message ran in the Echo on the 6th of September. Meanwhile, Bournemouth Police Station became the base for the biggest, most secretive investigation Dorset Police had ever known. Operation Hornbill.
There were about 100 officers that were working on the inquiry. We were working 24 hours a day.
Officers were selected from across the whole force area and put onto this specific investigation. Our colleagues didn't actually know what we were investigating, and we weren't allowed to tell them.
There was good reason for this secrecy. In 1990, a blackmailer named Rodney Whichelow was jailed for trying to extort millions of pounds from the food company Heinz. He'd carried out his threat to spike jars of supermarket baby food with broken glass and caustic soda. When police finally tracked him down, they found to their horror that he was a Metropolitan Police detective. Might the same be true of Sally?
There was always the concern that maybe Sally was a police officer. Some of the terminology used by Sally, he would say, "I've deployed a bomb," and the term "without prejudice," which he always used, gave the impression that maybe this was legal, it was police jargon, and we were again dealing with a police officer.
But whoever Sally was, he'd suddenly gone quiet. He'd failed to contact the police on the number they'd supplied in the Bournemouth Echo. And after another 2 weeks without communication, DSI Phil James called a meeting with colleagues from across the UK.
I was with senior officers from New Scotland Yard and from the National Kidnap and Extortion Unit. We were actually sitting there discussing the risk that Sally posed. He's not actually carried out any life-threatening menace. He's not actually sent any devices, and it's very difficult to assess the risk. There was a knock at the door, and I was told by one of my officers that in fact an incendiary device, a firebomb, had just gone off. The atmosphere of the meeting suddenly changed. Clearly there was a risk, and the threat was very, very real.
3 weeks after the Tesco bomber had written his first extortion demand, he carried out his threat. A device had exploded in a Bournemouth suburb, and police across the county were scrambled to the scene.
There had been an explosion at an address in Ferndown. The female occupant had opened a letter which had exploded in her face.
The victim was taken to hospital with minor injuries. Police called in the bomb squad.
It was quite easy to see that what we had was the remains of a very small amount of incendiary composition. It had been functioning inside a CD cassette case, and that in turn had been inside a jiffy bag of about A5, A4 size. From a technical point of view, this is not a lethal device, but it could have set fire to property and obviously endangering the public.
As the squad examined the device, it became clear that Sally was a resourceful bomb maker.
The device had been functioned by a party popper. This had been cut down and inserted into the cassette case. A safety pin that was attached to the jiffy bag had possibly been used as the anchor to then pull the party popper as the cassette was removed from the jiffy bag.
Once the device was declared safe, police warned the Royal Mail to be on the lookout for suspicious packages. Within hours, they received an emergency call from a nearby sorting office.
By the time we arrived, the police had done a good job of evacuating the immediate area, and obviously this was a fairly, major incident. The first priority really was to ascertain that we were dealing with the same level of threat, that we didn't, have devices that were significantly more dangerous.
Well aware of the bomber's recent threat to deploy bigger devices, the bomb squad used a portable X-ray machine to scan the 3 packages.
Having taken the X-rays and then realised that we were dealing with the same type of device, we came up with a plan.
To preserve as much evidence as possible, the squad would defuse the letter bombs by hand.
This wasn't a device that had actually, to my knowledge, been seen before, but it followed common principles. We had to separate the party popper string from the safety clip and then taking apart the case and removing the amount of explosive that was there.
But as the squad continued their task, the bomber expanded his operation. 7 more menacing letters were sent to Tesco customers' homes.
These were letters that identified that they'd been followed home, that Sally knew that they were Tesco's customers, and that they may be subject to further threats or bombs through the post.
I realised that things become a lot more serious, and that the extortionists were saying to us, you know, I've told you I can do this, I've done it, now give me the money.
It was quite a shock, really, to think that the person that was responsible had actually gone to the next step. By actually sending devices, he's really sort of upping the stakes and making it an awful lot more serious.
As Tesco tried to reassure their customers, the police decided to issue a wider public warning.
We're advising members of the public to be extremely vigilant and exercise caution regarding any suspicious or unaccepted packages they receive.
Meanwhile, the bomb squad were placed on 24-hour standby.
The likelihood of needing a bomb squad to be positioned in Bournemouth to respond to threats made by an extortionist is unique. The only time we ever have the bomb squad stationed in Dorset is when we have a political party conference.
As the police braced themselves for further attacks, they placed 2 more personal ads in the Echo, begging the bomber to get in touch. But while they still didn't know who they were dealing with, a new theory about the bomber began to take shape.
Although Tesco's is a national company, the demand was made against a local Tesco store. We had a fire in a local post box. The demand was that club cards were placed in the local Bournemouth Echo, and as far as I was concerned, the offender was likely to be local to me.
To explore this theory, detectives called in a specialist unit.
A geographic profiler tries to help the police focus their inquiries by working out where the offender lives. And we do that by analysing the crimes or series of crimes that the individual has committed. Criminals are no different to everyday Joe public. Your geography is inherent in you and what you do. You build up what we call a mental map. What happens with criminals, they tend to commit crime within areas they have familiarity with.
The team logged all the crime scenes, including the newsagents, the site of the explosion, and the burned-out postbox. The locations were analysed by computer, which produced an area of focus. The results appeared to support the detectives' hunch.
We ended up with an area profile of probably just over a mile square, in and around where they had the postbox and the newsagent. Those are the areas that we suggested that they focused their inquiries.
Any suspect living within the catchment zone became a target for surveillance.
There were employees with links to people called Sally. There were individuals with links to the store at Ferndown where the letters were being sent. And we had to consider all of these possibilities.
But DSI James was convinced that one location above all would lead him to the bomber.
I always thought that we would catch Sally through the postbox at Bradpole Road. He'd used it at the beginning of September. I was convinced that Sally would go back to that postbox again.
Undercover officers placed the postbox under filmed surveillance.
We use various sorts of methods, workmen doing different things, which hopefully didn't draw attention to us. The golden rule of surveillance is you cannot make yourself invisible. No one's invisible. You're going to be seen. It's whether you're noticed.
With the surveillance operation underway, police now asked Tesco to consider a strategy that would only be used if the bombings escalated.
The police request came in that, well, we need to consider putting these cards in the Bournemouth Echo as a fallback position in case things get to that stage.
the company's head of security was less than enthusiastic.
My concern really was, is someone going to get seriously injured here? Is our reputation going to be damaged? Are we going to lose a lot of money by the decisions that I'm agreeing to?
But the police had good reason to believe that this tactic might work. In the mid-1990s, blackmailer Edgar Pierce had carried out a similar extortion campaign against Barclays Bank and supermarket giant Sainsbury's. The so-called Mardi Gras bomber had also insisted on receiving his cash through ATMs. But he was caught after police put hundreds of them under round-the-clock surveillance.
Our policy is that we wouldn't pay any extortionist, but that we would certainly support a police operation which meant going along and paying money in a controlled fashion. That's something that we would certainly consider.
In mid-October, as Tesco evaluated the police request, the bomber issued a new threat.
Sally explained that he was fed up with our stalling, he felt that we needed to get on and meet his demands, and he described the new generation of device. This was to be a pipe bomb that he would place in a garden of a Tesco's customer, and it would be capable of killing people. We naturally consulted with the bomb squad.
Our assessment was that, if he's capable of making the devices that we'd encountered so far, he was going to be more than capable of taking the next step to produce a pipe bomb. The difference being the devices he previously made were unconfined low explosives, so they were only ever going to burn. Once you encase low explosives in something like a metal pipe, you actually then get an explosion that will produce fragmentation, and now people will be injured and potentially killed.
But while the bomber's letter gave no indication when or where the device would be planted, it provided a new way for the police to talk to him in detail about his demands.
Sally actually sent a 3-part cipher code which would allow us to communicate with him.
Unlike the personal ads that could be read by anyone, the code allowed the police to send a detailed message hidden within a seemingly random sequence of letters. Detectives could now clearly explain why the bomber's ATM plan was unworkable.
It was quite a complex and a lengthy way of doing it, but it ensured that we could communicate with him without other people knowing about it. I came up with the idea of the pretext that it was a Mensa puzzle, and that it in fact would appear in several different adverts in the Daily Echo.
To ensure that the message ran without a hitch, DSI James contacted the newspaper's editor.
Phil actually said to me, look, I need to speak to you down here at the station, and nobody must know that we're actually meeting.
Thanks for coming, Statler.
He basically told me how Sally and the police had actually been communicating through the classified sections of the Daily Echo. I mean, I was gobsmacked, but absolutely fascinated. And then he came up with the big bombshell about wanting to work with the paper to actually get specific messages across to Sally.
Butterworth would be required to keep the operation secret from even his most trusted staff.
The issue for me was I had to explain to an advertising manager and a general manager why we were putting free adverts in the paper, what they were, without giving too many details away.
But within days of the coded message appearing in the paper, there was a dramatic breakthrough. Police traced the bomber's latest letter back through the postal system to the box at Bradpole Road. The Tesco bomber had been captured on camera. For 2 months, the Tesco bomber had been waging his campaign of terror. His latest letter threatened to plant a lethal pipe bomb in the garden of one of the store's customers. But in sending it, the bomber had blundered. He'd used the same postbox in Bradpole Road, which the police had placed under filmed surveillance.
We managed to establish the times at which the box was emptied, so we knew that the letter had been posted in that box.
By this time, I've got surveillance officers down there. I've got CCTV covering that post box.
Officers retrieved the surveillance footage, convinced the Tesco bomber would soon be unmasked.
It's a very dark night. It's raining very heavily. There's a lot of traffic on the road. And it proves virtually impossible to identify any of the posters of letters in that postbox during that period.
Well, I think the comment was, can't you blow it up a bit? Enhance it for me. And of course, you can only work with what you've got. If the image initially is poor, you get a bigger, poorer image.
What had seemed so promising had turned out to be useless. After thousands of hours of patient police work, the bomber's identity remained a mystery.
You've got to imagine we're months into this inquiry. We've had the opportunity and nearly got Sally. This was a very difficult time for the inquiry and the team that were working on it.
Desperate for a breakthrough, officers sent Sally a new coded message asking him to agree to a money drop rather than collecting his cash through ATM machines. If he agreed, officers would be waiting for him. But Sally sensed the trap.
He was steadfast in the fact that he only wanted the technical demands that he'd said, and he never believed that we couldn't actually meet his demands. He always thought we were stalling, so it became very difficult to persuade him otherwise.
After this exchange, the bomber's letters stopped.
We weren't sure if our messages were getting through to Sally. As a consequence of that, we were concerned that the device might be exploded.
But 3 weeks later, the bomber finally got back in touch. His patience was running out.
Sally had provided a deadline. He'd said we had until Saturday, the 12th of December. He also referred to an A to Z map of Bournemouth.
In less than a month, the pipe bomb would be planted. In time, Sally would issue a grid reference for its location. With the deadline approaching, police considered activating their last-ditch strategy, issuing the modified ATM cards. But catching the bomber as he used them would be a massive undertaking.
We were looking at, I think, 25,000 ATM sites in the UK and about 250 in the conurbation. It was a huge operation potentially for us, one that would involve the National Crime Squad, not an operation that Dorset could have performed on its own.
But although there might be thousands of ATMs across the country for the bomber to choose from, Tesco were determined not to make it easy for him.
We could let 3 or 4 be used, but then put a stop on all the cards. Despite all his planning, he would have had to have been lucky to have got away with it.
As Tesco commenced the huge task of producing 50,000 cash cards, police surveillance was beefed up.
I was determined that we would have really good coverage of that postbox, and in fact we had 7 cameras. I had cameras just on top of the postbox, I had a fisheye camera in the newsagent's window, and I had other cameras covering the road.
But as the police continued their stakeout, news came that the cards could not be produced before the December the 12th deadline. Detectives tried to buy some time.
That was the basis of our communication with Sally. We are trying to work with you, but we cannot meet your demands by the deadline you've given us. We're really keen to move that deadline forward.
But a full week before the deadline was due to expire, the bomber got tired of waiting.
He had actually deployed a bomb in somebody's garden. He provided a grid reference to show where he had placed that bomb. Unfortunately, that grid reference covered a square kilometre and in fact 19 roads and 550 houses in an area of Ferndown.
Hundreds of officers flooded the area. The operation became headline news.
Detectives searching for a bomb which a blackmailer claims he's planted in Dorset are continuing their investigations today. A large area of Ferndown remains sealed off, while police and bomb disposal experts scour the area.
It was effectively an inch-by-inch search through the gardens and through the bushes, through the sheds and anything that existed within those gardens. This was a really tense time for Dorset Police. We had to find that device.
Police and military personnel searching for an explosive device said to have been placed in the area. So far, nothing's been found.
But as the search entered its second day, shocked detectives feared the worst.
Everybody that was working in Ferndown at that time, they were convinced that actually the bomb had gone off.
All the police resources went running round there responding to this, and it turned out it was a couple of young apprentices who had exploded some hydrogen balloons from a local garage, and they thought it was a bit of a giggle.
On the 7th of December, 3 days into the search, Sally wrote again. The apprentices were not the only ones who were hoaxing.
He explained in his letter that we could stand down, that he actually hadn't deployed a device, but if we stalled, there was always the threat.
This time, the bomber had been bluffing. Next time, the police might not be so lucky.
We deployed additional overt high visibility patrols. We put out bomb casts to respond to calls from the public in relation to suspect devices. So we provided everything that we could in reassuring the public that we were taking this matter extremely seriously.
But as the police stepped up their public presence, their undercover operation yielded a significant breakthrough. Sally's latest letter, which revealed that the pipe bomb was a hoax, had been traced back to the Bradpole Road postbox.
I knew on this occasion I had very good footage. I knew that hopefully that we'd be able to identify him from it.
But the bomber was not the only person to have used the postbox that day.
Unfortunately, this is the run-up to Christmas, and during the period that Sally posted, he was one of 38 posters who posted between them 172 letters. So it then became a very difficult problem to try and identify which poster was Sally.
I had 38 images, so I knew that one of those people was our offender. That was the frustration.
Catching the bomber was made more difficult by Royal Mail rules preventing the police opening any of the posted letters.
Queen's Post is sacrosanct. We couldn't delay it, we couldn't interfere with it at all. So we had probably a matter of 5-10 minutes to try and gain as much information as we could from the letters before they had to go on their way.
Before the letters were sorted, officers copied all the addresses on the envelopes. Once they'd been delivered, they contacted the recipients, pretending to be managers from the Royal Mail.
We explained that there was a problem with the mail in that area, and could they just tell us who had sent that letter in order that we could make inquiries with them.
As detectives worked their way through the addresses, surveillance officers kept watch on the postbox.
My view was certainly that a lot of those 38 would be regulars that live in the local area or pass that way regularly and use that postbox.
When one of the suspects was spotted, the police were ready to act.
We did that through various means, actual physical surveillance, following people from the postbox. Some actually walked back to their home address, which was nice and easy for us, or back to a motor vehicle so we could obtain a registration number.
But such close surveillance was risky.
Of course, if Sally becomes aware of our interest before we get to him, he can destroy any of the evidence that maybe he's got within his home.
DSI James knew any error now could spell disaster.
This inquiry now was close to being 6 months old. We'd received maybe 20, 25 letters. We'd sent coded messages. We'd received incendiary devices. We'd had threats that garden bombs had been placed in gardens. This was a crucial period of time for us. The level of tension was very high.
In late December, as officers watched the postbox, they made an identification that they hoped would never happen.
One of the 38 posters was a local police officer that worked within Bournemouth.
Just as the investigators had feared, it appeared that the bomber might be one of their own. 5 months into the hunt for the Tesco bomber, detectives were finally closing in. They knew the bomber was one of 38 people captured on tape using the Bradpole Road postbox in Bournemouth. But as they continued the stakeout, they made a disturbing discovery. One of their suspects was a police officer.
We had been concerned that a police officer may have been involved because of the use of jargon that indicated perhaps somebody had knowledge of the law.
If the bomber was an officer from the Dorset force, he might even have inside information about the investigation.
That became even more relevant when we identified that he was a local police officer that worked within Bournemouth, and we became very interested in him.
The officer was duly interrogated by detectives. But within hours, it became clear he was not the man they were looking for.
He was totally innocent, and it was just by pure coincidence that he happened to post a letter.
With the police officer in the clear, detectives concentrated on narrowing down their list of suspects further.
We identified a small number of persons fairly quickly, particularly those who were writing to businesses and companies. But we were left with a small number of individuals we hadn't been able to identify.
After weeks of work, police had eliminated all but 9 of the people who had used the Bradpole Road postbox. And on the 17th of February, the number of suspects dropped to just 1.
We noticed one of the people that we were trying to identify walking along the service road carrying a plastic petrol can. At that time, there was a filling station at the end of the service road. Didn't need to be a rocket scientist to work out that he'd probably been to the garage.
The filling station's CCTV cameras showed a scruffy, middle-aged white man at the counter.
Officers established that, in fact, our poster had purchased petrol at that station and had paid by cheque.
The cheque was traced to a 50-year-old unemployed electrician from the Kinson area of Bournemouth. His name was Robert Edward Dyer.
We carried out surveillance in the hope that maybe he would post a letter, that he would show some interest in Tesco's, maybe visit Tesco's stores. Unfortunately, that didn't happen.
Dyer, who had no previous convictions, spent much of his time visiting his elderly mother and carrying out errands. On 2 occasions, police filmed him driving in the vicinity of Bradpole Road. Both times, Dyer did nothing to arouse suspicion.
At that stage, this individual wasn't of any great significance. At the end of the day, I made the decision that we would go and knock on his door and carry out a procedure that we'd done with many of the other posters before.
To eliminate suspects, police used a specialised software program to examine their home computers.
It was a case of inserting a disk into the computer. That would then search their hard drive looking for specific words. And if it found any of those words, it would display on the screen the actual document that it related to.
On February the 19th, officers called at Dyer's home in Caroline Road.
When I went in, it was quite a small bungalow. It was a 2-bedroom bungalow. Jeff and Paul sat in the lounge with Mr. Dyer, and they started asking him where he was on certain dates and things like that. I went into his bedroom where he had a computer and started the scan process. It was quite a sombre type of atmosphere within the actual bungalow itself. It wasn't long before it indicated that it had found some of the words and displayed on the screen a whole demand letter. From walking in the door to suddenly sitting in a room by myself thinking, this is where we are, Mr. Dyer is the offender. That was quite some moment. It was quite strange really, because there was no real reaction. He was very quiet, didn't say anything, and just remained emotionless really.
I get a phone call from the team. I thought they were trying to wind me up. But it was the man, and we actually had found Sally.
After a 6-month campaign of terror, the hunt for the Tesco bomber was finally over.
We interviewed Mr. Dyer for a number of days and gave him the opportunity to give his account.
What I can't understand at the moment is you can't remember sitting at the computer drafting this letter.
I don't understand it either, but that is the case.
He made no direct admissions when questions were put to him about his commission of the offence.
You might not understand why you did it, but I think you remember doing it.
No. I don't understand either.
But while Dyer refused to admit his guilt, the police discovered more damning evidence against him.
I was involved in the search of Dyer's home address. In the kitchen of the premises, I took apart the gas boiler and stuffed the works of the boiler. I found a folded up piece of paper, which in fact turned out to be the coded notes. It was in his own handwriting, and the code was unique to this case.
On the same day that Dyer's cipher code was discovered, the last of the Tesco bomber's letters was intercepted by the police. Surveillance footage showed Dyer posting it 24 hours before his arrest. The letter exactly matched the document found on his home computer.
He carried out everything that he did from home. He had a shed which he'd set up to allow him to make the devices. He was an individual working on his own, in desperate need of money and believing that Tesco's were the answer to all his problems.
As Dyer's interrogation continued, it emerged that he had read up on the extortion cases the police had previously identified.
Dyer on one occasion had sat in a doctor's surgery. There was a copy of the Reader's Digest, and contained within was the story of the Mardi Gras bomber, and that was his inspiration to carry out his offence.
Police also discovered why he had used a female alias.
We found out that the connection to Sally was that once he had a dog called Sally.
On the 4th of May 2001, Robert Edward Dyer appeared at Dorchester Crown Court. He pleaded guilty to 9 counts of blackmail and 1 of common assault for sending the letter bomb. He was jailed for 16 years, later reduced to 12 on appeal. Bournemouth could breathe easily again.
We ran, I think, 7 pages in the newspaper. We could then tell the story of how the Echo had helped Dorset Police actually nail him.
His motivation was purely a financial one. He's an incredibly dangerous man.
He had no real connection with Tesco. I think he saw Tesco as the gravy train. He was lucky that no one died or was seriously injured.
He made a number of simple mistakes. And whereas people might think in the future they could copy this offence, this is a very difficult type of offence to carry out, and if you try it, you will be caught.
To this day, no extortion attempt against a British supermarket has ever succeeded.